Good evening. I'm Kalamazoo City Deputy Manager Jeff Chamberlain, and welcome to tonight's special joint meeting of the City of Kalamazoo's City Commission and Kalamazoo's Citizen Public Safety Review and Appeal Board of Tuesday, August 10, 2021. Tonight's meeting is being streamed live on the City of Kalamazoo's Facebook page, as well as the City of Kalamazoo's YouTube channel. You can listen in to tonight's meeting by calling area code 269-552-6425 and entering meeting ID number 940-1017-4288 when prompted. And you can also leave a public comment for tonight's meeting by calling area code 269-226-6573. And I'd like to turn tonight's meeting over to Mayor David Anderson and Chairman Vernon Payne.
Thank you very, very much, Deputy City Manager Chamberlain. I appreciate it. I would like to call this joint meeting of the Kalamazoo City Commission and Citizens Public Safety Review and Appeals Board to order. Just a little comment here before I ask Clerk Borling to call the roll for the City Commission is that this is a committee of the whole meeting, and it is unusual in that we've haven't had a public meeting, a joint meeting with the board known as CSCRAB, the Citizen Public Safety Review and Appeal Board. So this is unique for us. For those of you who have tuned in for this, it's going to be possibly a little bit challenging because there'll be many more people that we will be watching on the screen here. And as we go through the meeting here, we're still going to try to follow our regular protocol where I would be calling on commissioners and Chair Payne will be calling on people who are members of the Citizen Board, and we may not be able to see hands and that kind of thing. So it could be a little clunky here and there, but we'll try to do the best job we can. And Chair Vernon Payne and I are going to kind of tag team back and forth. I think we're all set for that. Appreciate it. So with that all said, I will go ahead and ask Clerk Borling to please call the roll for the City Commission. And one reminder for all of us is that on these Zoom meetings, we need to identify where we are geographically.
Commissioner Cunningham.
Here in the great city of Kalamazoo.
Commissioner Hess.
Here in Kalamazoo.
Commissioner Knott.
Here at Kalamazoo.
Commissioner Pradle.
Present in the city of Kalamazoo.
Commissioner Urban.
Here in the city of Kalamazoo.
Vice Mayor Griffin.
Here in the city of Kalamazoo.
Mayor Anderson.
Here in the city of Kalamazoo. Thank you so much, Clerk Borling. Chair Payne, are you prepared or do you need some assistance there to go through your roll call and your opening your meeting?
We're prepared if we have staff available to do the roll call for us, but I would like to echo your sentiments, Mayor Anderson. I think that this particular group, the commission and the board should meet more often. I think that we should have better communications across all lines in city government, particularly the commission and this particular board, because of the things that are going on in our community that are so important to all of us. And so I will call the Citizens Public Safety Review and Appeal Board meeting in order as well. I would ask Ms. Vargas to call the roll.
Christopher Caldwell. Luis Garcia.
Here in Kalamazoo.
Curtis Gardner.
Here in Kalamazoo.
Daniel Hamilton. He is having some technical difficulties and should be joining us, so I can circle back. Oliver Howell.
Here in Kalamazoo.
Barbara Miller.
Here in Kalamazoo.
Vernon Payne.
Here, Kalamazoo.
Jaquise Robertson.
Here. I'm actually in Portage.
Susan Stapleton.
Here in Kalamazoo.
Larry Tolbert.
Present in Kalamazoo.
And as I mentioned, Daniel Hamilton should be joining us shortly. He is trying to connect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I just want to make sure that all of you on the Citizen Public Safety Review and Appeal Board, it is a pleasure to have you here with us for this joint meeting. We really appreciate your participation here with the City Commission. And a reminder for all of us and for anyone who is watching this meeting is that this is one step in the process. This is not the end of our process. There'll be more comments to this effect along the line here, but this is really a specific opportunity tonight, and that will be for the OIR group to present an executive summary of their 111-page report, and there'll be opportunities for questions from this body. But this is really, I would say, the beginning of whatever it is, step 2 or step 3 here, which will continue on. These things will be discussed in a whole variety of venues here going forward. And obviously, we will be looking for responses to the OIR report from our, our great team that works at the city. So that's where we're at. This isn't the end. This isn't the last chance. This is part of a continuing process for our engagement all together as we look at the details in this report. We are now at the time on our agenda when we have opportunity for public comments. Deputy City Manager Chamberlain, are there any public comments?
Yes, sir, we do. We'll go ahead and play those right now.
Good evening. My name is Sade Chambers. I am a resident in the city of Kalamazoo, and I was just calling for the public comment section to place my concern about the OIR report done on our public safety here in Kalamazoo in the city. And with this report, I am extremely disappointed. This report had a lot of flaws and a lot of errors in it where things were not discussed. And I felt as much as we paid for this study to be done, that this group that was doing this study should have pressed on Kalamazoo Public Safety to give more details, to give more updates, to give more findings, to give more of their reports. There should have also been talks in more detail as to why the police chief was told to resign. There should have been a lot more details. And in this study, it seemed almost as though our public safety officers were almost coddled when there were a lot of mishaps and a lot of missteps that public safety took on several events this past summer that should have been handled much better. And going forward, we need to hold our officers accountable. Our city elected officials need to also be held accountable. Our mayor needs to speak up. Our city commissioners need to speak up. And when things happen, we need to not just open up our hands and say, oops. People need to speak up, and our public safety needs to be held accountable. Our new chief needs to be held accountable. Going forward, we need to do better, because the coddling from this whole thing that was written up, it was pitiful. We need better, and we need our public safety to do better. And as a citizen, we need to do better. This study didn't do anything except still show that there are flaws in our system and that we are still hiding things, because that's what our public safety did. We're still hiding things, and they're not being held accountable, and we need to do better. I thank you for your time. I hope that we can work on this as a city, and I hope that things can be better. And I hope from this study that you guys that all sit on that dais, the mayor, the vice mayor, city commissioners, that you all take this into account, and that you all work together with our public safety to help build up something better and something more accountable, because this is not it. Thank you so much.
Hi, this is TC Custard, Kalamazoo City Limits. I am calling to comment on the OIR report that was released. I definitely do not think that this report gave us the answers that we were looking for, as well as just left us with more questions than it was solidified answers. I think that for $75,000, this was not worth the resources that have been spent on it. I definitely feel like their overall report can be misinterpreted as if it came off biased, as that's how I perceived it. I also feel like the story didn't reveal anything that we didn't already know. It's just I'm interested to see the feedback, and I'm interested to also see where we go from here. I definitely think under new leadership, some of these recommendations have been implemented, so I'm curious to see what has changed since then as to where we are now. Again, I have many questions. I would like to know, why was the majority of the officers' cameras not recording during this? I would like to know why certain reports were denied. Again, I definitely do not think that the report gave us the information that we need, and I am just hoping that the community can call in and give their feedback as well and see where we go. Thanks a lot for the opportunity. Have a good night.
Hello, my name is Zachary Lassiter. I live in the city of Kalamazoo. First off, I want to say how disappointed I am in this report. I'm disappointed that public safety refused to cooperate and turn over reports to the investigators. I'm disappointed we paid $75,000 for them just to refuse to cooperate. I'm disappointed in general. I mean, that's the biggest thing. I think there needs to be a change in leadership. How can we expect public safety officers to change and be held accountable when we have Jim Ritzma, who has been caught lying once, actually more than once now. He's also publicly apologized for the arrest of a reporter, but then quietly sent an email to public safety saying that he didn't mean that. And then also with the firing of the former chief, I mean, there needs to be accountability, and it starts with him. He was been in charge. He's made bad calls. He, and he was on the scene of one of the major incidents, calling the shots. I also think that the Public Safety Review and Appeals Board needs to be a commission-appointed board and not under the power of Jim Ritzma. I think the Office of Professional Standards should be put under that board and not under public safety. And I think that from now on, when we hire a police chief, that the city manager not have the only say. I think that the city manager should have to have the consent of the city commission when hiring a police chief. Thank you.
Yes, Jacob Johnson, Kalamazoo city resident, lifelong, third, fourth generation. Just calling in response to the report, which I haven't read in full, and calling kind of in response to the city's response of protests last summer. And I hope to get through more of the report, but I just want to ask, like city officials, what does accountability for racial injustice look like? And that what was experienced in the city was nothing short of racial terrorism. And, I question, what is accountability for the racial trauma that was perpetuated on behalf of the city and KDPS look like? And for me, having been pepper sprayed and being one of the peaceful protesters standing up for racial justice in my city, which I grew up in, and experienced constant harassment from KDPS, for me, it's a check. So you can make that payable to Jacob Kenny Johnson. I won't give my address here, but I really honestly, wholeheartedly feel like the city owes the residents who endured racial trauma and violence on behalf of the negligence of our city officials and leaders. And so I look forward and I expect to receive some type of compensation for that. So I look forward to seeing what that looks like in one way or another. And I just really want to leave us with that question. What does accountability look like in a city that upholds values of equity and justice? What does accountability for inequity and injustice, racial inequity and racial injustice on behalf of city officials look like? So let's sit with that. And as we come back with recommendations, let's get a line item in the budget from this great donation that the city has gotten to compensate individuals who have endured harm and violence, racial harm, racial violence, in the context of America and Kalamazoo's history, which has always been present with racial violence and racial trauma. So look forward to hearing more about what that accountability looks like. Thank you. Black Lives Matter.
Yes, this is Will Baker calling from the city of Kalamazoo. I'd like to make a comment on the OIR report that was released late last week. As a citizen of Kalamazoo, I wonder if it was wisely spent, the 75 grand or whatever it was to spend it. Initially, the report shows roughly the same what the city's internal investigation showed late last year. And I wonder if it was just wasted money or, more of a show to say, okay, that the city had done something instead of actually getting whatever the truth may be. Although a lot of people don't like the results, I don't know if it's hard to say if there's no change, if there's really, we did receive the truth, or if it was just kind of throw money somewhere to say that money was spent.
Mr. Mayor and Chairman Payne, that was the last public comment.
Thank you very much, Deputy City Manager Chamberlain. I appreciate that very much. Next on our agenda, and the main agenda item for tonight, is discussion items. And I will turn it over to City Manager Jim Ritzma.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Vice Chair Payne, or Chair Payne, and Vice Mayor. Just want to thank everyone for their time this evening. I know it's hard to go back to last year and look at that from the OIR's perspective, but I appreciate what the work they did, and look forward to how we can learn as an organization, as a public safety agency, to do better for our community. And so we, as the mayor mentioned, our goal is to do just that. And that's going to take some time. So the purpose for tonight's meeting is for OIR to present their report to these public bodies, and then allow time for question and answering for that. And then I will come up at the end with some next steps, suggested next steps, how we move this forward. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Chair Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Ritzma. I would like to update everyone on the process that was used to select OIR. Ms. Dorla Bonner led that effort, along with board member Howe and myself. And a national RFP was put in place, and firms and individuals on a national level were invited to answer that RFP and submit the information that was specific to the incidents that occurred in Kalamazoo. It was a very intense and extensive process, and OIR emerged as, after a thorough background check, etc., as a group that was selected. And so I want to particularly thank Ms. Bonner and Mr. Howe for their efforts in that regard. I would also like to now introduce OIR to you. And just a couple comments very quickly. Michael Giannacco, who is one of the founding members of OIR, led the effort here in Kalamazoo. Mr. Giannacco, before joining OIR, was a civil rights section, led a civil rights section of the United States Attorney's Office for the Central District of California. He also served for 10 years as a trial attorney with the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department in Washington, D.C. Additionally, and I want to congratulate Mr. Jody Steiger, who was a subject matter expert here in Kalamazoo, who testified in the George Floyd murder trial. And he testified for the prosecution and was outstanding in terms of the subject matter expertise that he brought to that process. And so this group that we had come into Kalamazoo, very deep bench, a lot of experience. And so with that said, I would like to turn it over to Mr. Giannakko. One other comment though. I think it's very, very important that if we are to digest everything that's in that report, it's imperative that you read every jot and tittle and all 115 pages. Now, I read it 3 times because I have to really work to get things digested. But you cannot go off headlines. You cannot go off the first read. I think you really have to go through that document very, very carefully because as some of the citizens have commented, it is a nuanced document and it's a layered document. And I think you have to put the time in to get the full impact of what was written. With that said, I'd like to turn the meeting over to Mr. Giannakko.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for the introduction, Chair Payne, Mr. Mayor, Ms. Vice Mayor, Commissioners, and members of the Review and Appeal Board. It is our privilege to be before you this evening. We look forward to the discussion. We do intend to provide some introductory remarks at a high level. Obviously, as Chair Payne has already indicated, the information is necessarily dense in places and does require a close read before the context of this can be fully understood. We tried to break it down as best we could, and we also tried to identify issues that are certainly worthy of further consideration. And as the mayor indicated, and as your city manager indicated, we appreciate city leadership being present as well as the chief for our presentation. Our goal, and as we understood our assignment, was to provide an accounting of what transpired in June and August of last year, but with a goal towards using those learning lessons to improve and better prepare the city and its Department of Public Safety for future similar challenges. And it is with that overlay that we entered into our assignment, and it was with that sentiment that we completed the assignment. Some would prefer that, we call things either one way or the other, but things are usually more complicated than that. One of my colleagues is want to say that most often the truth, to the degree there is a truth, is somewhere in the middle. And we tried to define where that middle was in the spectrum, but it's not all one way or another. There are criticisms and there are compliments because the Department of Public Safety and your city deserves both. They deserve compliments and they deserve critiques when appropriate. Our goal was not to play gotcha. Our goal was to identify both of those, the praiseworthiness of certain decisions, as well as the critique of certain decisions, with, again, the goal of making that commentary intended to be helpful and to come up with a framework through which the city's leadership can work with the Department of Public Safety to better prepare for the next round of challenges that any public safety organization will have. It won't be exactly the same as last year, but there will be future challenges. And to the degree that our recommendations can assist in that regard, we are hopeful that they will. And as Chair Payne also indicated, this is not our first rodeo. We have been invited and have already reported on the ways in which police agencies throughout this country have responded to protest activity from last year. And while every situation was different, every situation ends up deserving of that kind of introspection, deserving of that kind of insight, and deserving of that kind of development of recommendations intended to better prepare organizations for what may happen in the future. And so whether it was Iowa City, Iowa, or Santa Monica, California, or Santa Rosa, California, or soon to be San Jose, California, all of those agencies had similar challenges. All of them dealt with them in some ways similarly, but in other ways quite differently. And so we used that experience in an effort to do the best we could with regard to providing insight on what transpired in your city. We do have sort of a PowerPoint that is really intended to sort of shape the conversation, if you will, at least our presentation piece. And if we could pull that up now, that would be great. And so this is essentially our assignment. Teresa, if you can move to the next slide.
Sorry, Mike, I'm going to try this again.
All
Carry
right.
on.
Well, it'll be hard to carry on without the slide.
Sorry. There we go. Sorry, it's not allowing me to advance in this particular share screen.
Okay.
That's David Anderson here. Is that something that we can assist with on our side, Deputy City Manager Chamberlain?
Yes, sir. Well, let's pull the one up here. If you want to stop
Sorry.
your share screen.
Sure will.
I believe that is working out.
Yeah, that if you can move to the next slide. There you go. Thank you very much. This is just intended to show the way in which we approached the assignment. We were asked to provide an after action report of the way in which the police responded in May, June of last year, as well as the response on August 15th, when the Proud Boys came to visit your city. And so we did the evaluation review. I think that an important piece of this that we appreciated being included in the scope of work was the ability to listen. And we appreciated that opportunity to hear from your community in various ways. Through the assistance of your city leaders, they were able to help us coordinate listening sessions that garnered a whole lot of input from your city on all sides. And the degree of input ran the gamut from one spectrum to the other. And it was important, in our view, to hear from individuals who had lived it, who had seen it, who had watched the events. And it was very helpful to receive their input. That did shape the way in which we evaluated the other data points that we received along the way. We also appreciated the graciousness of time provided to us by others who had one-on-one conversations with us, who sent us emails, who provided comment in all kinds of forms. And every one of those voices were important to us to hear. That was also supplemented by the opportunity to talk with city leadership. And we appreciated each and every one of you who took the time to provide your perspective. And that, again, ended up being very helpful as part of our process. So it was a dual process in which we received materials from public safety, reports from public safety, input from public safety, as well as input from your community at large regarding the events that were under review. We also did include in our report and recognize that the city didn't stand still and the Department of Public Safety didn't stand still while we were doing this work. Appreciated the work of the subcommittee that was devised by the city. Appreciated the work that the Department of Public Safety did as we were moving forward. In some ways, before we even began our project, the Department of Public Safety were already looking at ways to improve the way in which they would respond the next time they would have similar challenges. And finally, as a handoff, we devised 40 recommendations that are intended to set the stage and for the city's consideration on ways in which to improve future responses to protest activity in your city. Mr. Chamberlain, if you can go to the next slide. So today, this evening, what we are going to do, we are not going to go over all 40 recommendations. We are not going to read from all 111 pages of our report, but really we intend to provide a high-level review of that report, focusing on, again, sort of an executive summary perspective and some of the key findings and recommendations. But we urge, as I think Chair Payne has already done, urge those who are interested in learning what we found and what we recommend through the reading of the report, which is obviously available to anybody at this point. But we do intend to provide a high-level presentation this evening for the benefit of your public and the benefit of commissioners and members of the Review and Appeals Board. We also obviously will be available to answer any particular questions that you might have. And I should say that this is not your only opportunity to ask us questions. As you all move through in your process, we intend to continue to be a resource for you, and we're obviously prepared to answer questions down the road should they come up as you go forward with your good work. Next slide, Deputy Manager. These are two of the main takeaways. I think I've already really talked about it. The complication, the nuances of any response involving scores of individuals, dealing with scores of individuals is going to be more complicated than everything what was done was wrong or everything was done was right. We did find, though, that there was no discriminatory motive behind any of KDPS's actions, but that there was room for improvement. And we will highlight some of that, some of those areas this evening. And finally, we encourage, not that we need to, because we feel that the city already has this culture, which is to envelop and include the community and bring KDPS to the table to continue strengthening police-community relations. Next slide, please. These are some of the areas that we focused on because they were included within our scope of work, and also because these are important and critical with regard to how you assess, how you evaluate, how you interpret the various decision-making that was done in preparation and during the protest activity that occurred in late May and early June. And again, on that day in August 15th, when the Proud Boys marched through your city. So these are the topical areas that we sort of divided up with regard to things that we thought was important to cover in our report. Next slide, please. We're going to now turn to some of the focuses on the actual planning and response to the protest activity in May and June. And for this piece, I will turn it over to my longtime colleague, somebody I've worked with for 20 years on oversight and policing. Steve Connolly, you want to take over?
Thank you, Mike, and good evening, everybody. So in terms of the comparison and contrast, which was really in some ways some of the genesis of this project as far as from the city's perspective and just in terms of the events of last summer. Starting with May and June, and in comparison to August 15th, of course, was one afternoon, and we'll talk a little bit about the planning that preceded that and maybe what could or should have been done differently, but the events themselves were actually relatively restricted into a few hours that afternoon, whereas the events in May and June unfolded over the course of a few different days that we ended up focusing on, with the first of those being Saturday, May 30th, and then we took our analysis up through the curfew enforcement on June 2nd, which was sort of the last major element of the police enforcement response during those days. So it's difficult to really summarize those because there were distinctive characteristics of each of those days. And I certainly want to thank Chair Payne for encouraging people to read the whole report and kind of recall if it's been, obviously it's been 14 months or however long now, recall the different events that occurred as those days unfolded and some of the challenges in real time that the city and KDPS were attempting to deal with. So we found that there really were strong fundamentals. The operation planning skills of the department were very, very impressive to us in some ways. And they certainly have the whole idea of the incident command system and operations planning is something that we're very interested in. And it is clear to us, KDPS in part, I'm sure it's related to their kind of dual police and fire safety responsibilities. They are very, very good at some of the coordination, organization, and planning that other agencies do not have, because the police are sometimes autonomous in ways that it can be frustrating to other city partners or jurisdiction partners in terms of working together. So we were struck by that and thought that there were many impressive elements to some of the ops planning that occurred. The crowd management team was a big focus of our review process in terms of their very prominent responsibilities on each of those days. We thought that on May 30th in particular, the department showed a real consciousness of what was going on in the country and in the city and the nature of the protests, and really made a concerted effort to not be overbearing in their use of the crowd management team. You might recall that Thursday afternoon, it was a very, very limited deployment to assist officers who had been surrounded by a crowd, and they just kind of moved in, assisted in getting the officers out and moved back out again, instead of being a strong or sort of intimidating presence in any way. And there was a real thoughtfulness to the department's decision making in that regard. They were deferential to and sort of recognizing of the spirit in the street and the concerns of the community and the country over things that had happened in Minneapolis. And certainly we saw elements of restraint, and that the department was working closely with the city, made some very good choices in an effort to keep the situation as secure and safe for people as they possibly could be. The tension there is between, so if you picture Monday night, June 1st, and all of the activity on that day that had so many different components. So we think of May 30th as being overwhelmingly just kind of a very spirited protest day with large crowds in the streets and very focused on First Amendment expression. By Monday, things had become more complicated because there certainly was a significant element of the Black Lives Matter movement and the protest activity, and a lot of very, very sincere, upset people just trying to be heard and make their presence felt in the city in very constructive ways. Unfortunately, it was in a way that was obviously challenging for the department. That was sort of combined with a lot of other things that were happening that were sort of less pure, I guess, from a First Amendment perspective, from a protest perspective, and really had to do with, there were people trying to take advantage of the situation and just sort of disruptive activity that the KDPS was obviously responsible for responding to. So By the time Tuesday came around, you notice the organized protests on Monday during the day went relatively smoothly, and we saw a very detailed operations plan for the protests that had been planned for Monday. And I think those went off effectively and without police interference. If anything, the police facilitated that. But by the nighttime, there were a lot of different elements going on, and we go into some detail about the tough decisions that the department had to make, obviously in real time, and some of those we thought were more effective than others, and we'll get into detail. The concern that we had on certainly towards the end of the evening on Monday, but also very much on Tuesday, most dramatically, I think, in the curfew enforcement scenario, is that the police sometimes KDPS struggled to navigate between the protection of legitimate First Amendment activity and their desire to just control the situation, to shut down unlawful activity and to restore order to the extent possible. And those blurred lines created a few different scenarios where we feel like some of the decision-making probably merited some reconsideration, and we'll be talking about that. Next slide, please. So Mike, if you want to introduce our next colleague to take this slide, we'll kind of cover the same approach as it related to August 15th.
I'm not sure I need to do an introduction. Next up on our roster, please. Yep. Julie.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Julie Rulin. Thank you for having us. I'll jump right into it. On August 15th, we saw some different dynamics. One of the lessons that law enforcement agencies across the country learned earlier in the summer was that when a crowd is protesting against police violence and often against the police themselves, as they were that summer 2020, the presence of police at that protest could itself turn into a source of confrontation. And we saw this, the ways in which KDPS learned that lesson and the way they planned for the July 11th protest that happened in Kalamazoo that featured friends of George Floyd, when the department agreed to stage a couple of blocks away and out of view. And they successfully avoided any confrontation with protesters who marched and demonstrated peacefully, and that event went off successfully. The decision to treat the August 15th Proud Boys March in a similar way was puzzling, though, because of the recognition from the outset that it was a very different type of event. The KDPS operations plan noted that there were 3 organizations staging counter-protests with references to threats against the Proud Boys. Other KDPS intelligence acknowledged that the Proud Boys had a penchant for instigating violence. Nonetheless, the plan was to stage crowd management squads out of the area and out of sight, and to have them available if needed in the event that the protest became violent or there was property destruction. KDPS emphasized that this was consistent with the wishes of the pastor who had planned a vigil at the Arcadia Festival site at the time of the Proud Boy March. And again, we go into much more detail in our report about all of this, but they emphasized that, they made it clear to the pastor that they would not be able to respond immediately if fights had broken out, but that there would be some delay in their response. We found it curious throughout our interactions how much the department featured the pastor's role in its planning and then the way its discussion of the event unfolded. While it's certainly a good practice to take organizers' concerns and desires into account when planning a response, those concerns should not take precedence over its own intelligence, suggesting there were credible threats of violence, and its own role as a law enforcement agency in securing public safety. The focus on the pastor assumed that he had some level of control over all the elements who might show up to counter the Proud Boys. And even setting aside the idea that the pastor had instigated or condoned violence that day, we found not reasonable to assume that he could have stopped it once events had gotten underway. I want to turn it over now to our colleague, Jody Steiger, who Chairman Payne did an excellent job of introducing at the beginning of this. So he spared me that. Thank you, Mr. Payne. I'm going to turn it over to Jody to talk here a little bit about the overarching public safety goals and what a different sort of deployment strategy for August 15th could have looked like. Jody, if you want to take it away.
Thanks, Julie. I appreciate it. Good evening, everyone. I just want to talk about some of the public safety goals and some of the issues and concerns that you could see in the report. Some of the strategies that were used on July 11th, like some of my colleagues have already mentioned, I felt that we felt it would have been better suited for the August 15th incident as well. KDPS intelligence made it clear that they anticipated that there was a high probability of violence that was going to occur at this Proud Boys March, but they decided not to have any type of police presence there. In the July 11th event, having that police presence there, if they would have had the police presence there just like they did in July 11th event, we believe that regardless of what was requested from the counter-protest groups, would have been in the best interest of the community in order to deter any possibility of violence. Clearly, because of the nature of events that were going on in the country at that time, we felt that having a better strategic plan as they did for the July 11th event would have been better suited for the August 15th event as well.
Thanks, Jody. I think one of the things that that I think Jody's referencing with respect to July 11th is some of the pre-planning that took place, and some of the strategies we saw from KDPS and other marches earlier in the summer, where there would be an effort to meet with organizers in advance of the event. Here we saw that KDPS did try to reach out to the Proud Boys prior to the march, but then when they were not able to make that connection, then took the standoff approach on August 15th, whereas what better practice is in terms of crowd management would be to be out there, to establish a presence on the street, and then to meet with leaders prior to the beginning of the march to talk about the route, to talk about some of the ground rules for the demonstration, to develop a set of clear expectations and shared expectations about how the day might go and what the police involvement might be. And again, we saw that earlier in the summer in some of the different responses. On August 15th, there was a reluctance to do that and a reluctance to get involved before that march got started. The aim of all of it and the public safety goal is to prevent violence, to protect the community. And here it was a theme we heard certainly from community members, from everybody we talked to in Kalamazoo, that it seemed clear that predictable that you bring these two groups together in the context of last summer, and violence was very predictable, and there was frustration that the police did not do more to anticipate and prevent that. I'm going to continue talking here before I turn it back to colleagues. If you get the next slide, Jeff, we're going to talk about our next subject, which is arrests and enforcement activity. Relative to what was happening in a number of other jurisdictions, KDPS made a relatively small number of arrests over the days of protest in May and June, and then again on August 15th. Our analysis of the KDPS decision-making around these two time periods varies as much as the events themselves varied, largely because the arrest decisions spill over into questions of crowd management and decisions about establishment of police zones, curfew enforcement, which Teresa and Jody are going to talk about a little further in a minute. There are no perfect answers to these questions, and we recognize that decision-making in the moment is more difficult than the kind of after-the-fact evaluation that we engage in. Nonetheless, that is what we do. That's an after-action report. So we do go ahead and make some conclusions about arrests, because despite the small numbers, they attracted a lot of attention. And in particular, the August arrests, because of the perception that police were targeting counter-protesters while giving the Proud Boys a pass, in essence, preferential treatment for the Proud Boys. The arrests we found were legally justifiable, and in some cases were strategically wise. But just because you can make an arrest, especially in the crowd management context, does not mean that you necessarily should. Two of the more controversial arrests that got a lot of media attention were of the reporter from MLive and the legal observer, and those raised particular concerns. Neither of those two groups, reporters or observers, should be exempt from following police orders when attending or covering protests. But we think that there should be some different considerations happening before they're detained and ultimately arrested. And one of our recommendations is to require officers, whenever possible, to consult with a supervisor prior to arresting or detaining reporters or official observers. If that consultation can't happen before the detention, the officer should consult with a field supervisor before formally arresting and transporting to the county jail. And those are a couple of our specific recommendations that are numbered among our 40. Another and probably the sort of bigger theme of the arrest and enforcement piece of this had to do with the department's communication efforts. The chief apologized for the arrest of the reporter during a press event the next day, but the department has sort of walked that apology back. And one of the remedies was to discuss credentialing and to talk about providing instruction to journalists about proper identification, even though those things were not at issue in this particular incident. Again, this public communication piece was a big theme for us in this section of the report, but also throughout the report. The community's point of view here really focused on the accusations of selective enforcement and disparate treatment that followed the August event. The reality is more complicated and nuanced than the criticisms, but KDPS needed to recognize this perception to a greater degree than it did, and then effectively communicate with the public with a sensitivity to the optics and the broader community concerns that were going on. Its emphasis on the technicalities, on the technical justification for the arrest, the technical correctness of the arrest, the storyline that counter-protesters were the aggressors, it just missed the bigger point and the broader context of last summer's political and racial polarization. The failed communication strategy allowed the narrative of disparate treatment to be perpetuated and dominated pretty much every discussion we had with the Kalamazoo community regarding this event. As with many other areas we discuss in our report, we encourage KDPS to take a more introspective look at how it managed its community relationships and see some learning opportunities and opportunities for growth going forward. If we could get the next slide. And I will turn it over to my colleague, Teresa Magula, who's going to take over for a bit and talk about crowd management.
Right. Thank you, Julie. My name is Teresa Magula, and I'll be talking a little bit about some of the crowd management concepts that we saw in your city over the course of last summer. Certainly, we acknowledge this throughout the report, and it is worth noting here now that there were very unique circumstances and dynamic environments, not only in your city, but across the nation. And so it was very difficult to get this right. Yeah. So we acknowledge that set of circumstances as the context for what occurred over the nation. this past summer. But we also, in our report, consider two of the crowd management kind of tools that were used during the course of both May and June and August 15th. And what we saw first was that KDPS issued police zones as a crowd management concept. And for those that may not be familiar with the concept of the police zone, it's a public area that the chief has decided should be cleared of people for a variety of reasons, and that is defined in your own municipal code. Essentially, what it does is provides law enforcement this tool to clear an area, regardless of the crowd's specific actions, for a variety of different reasons. And we found that in May and in June, the establishment of these police zones did have a positive accomplishment of many of the public safety goals. For the particular June 2nd, we saw that having that police zone established and bringing in the National Guard to help secure some of the areas around the city's perimeter really did neutralize some of the disorder that happened the previous evening, people coming in from other areas and causing unrest that was distinctly different from the type of peaceful protest that was also happening in the city. But we also saw that in the context of First Amendment assembly, where the crowds were engaged in strictly peaceful protest and there was no emergent public safety concern, that use of the police zone had quite a chilling effect on the ability of people to express their First Amendment rights. We saw that especially happen in Arcadia Park on August 15th. We heard from many people who spoke with us that they were confused and that they were struck by the way in which KDPS was clearing the park using this blanket police zone. The area had at some point that day been a site of violence and unrest. But by the time the police zone was established, a lot of that violence in that specific area had been cleared, and there was no longer this exigent public safety need to clear the area. But we noted that KDPS really stuck to the notion of the police zone and cleared the park, arrested individuals at that time, all under the name of having the police zone established in that area. We also saw that there was the use of the curfew order, and that happened on June 2nd specifically. The curfew was intended again to prevent some of the unrest that had occurred in your city that previous evening on June 1st. But we noted that as the curfew time approached, it was 7 p.m. that evening, there was a group of protesters that refused to leave, and that group was standing around the intersection of Park and Michigan in your city. And that led to the standoff between KDPS and the protesters who were there. And it's worth noting that in our observation of various pieces of footage and evidence, that crowd was largely peaceful. They were standing and demonstrating, engaging in First Amendment protest. KDPS, however, was really intent on enforcing this curfew order. And the eventual result was deployment of tear gas and other less lethal munitions. And so, as you'll see in our report, we recommend a careful evaluation of both of those kinds of tools. So both the blanket police zones and the curfew orders, especially in crowd management situations. We recommend that KDPS and city leadership consider some alternative approaches to using those. And most importantly, that as KDPS and the city has done already, that they continue to engage with their community to establish guidelines and to establish some fundamentals for use of those types of enforcement tools. We did want to commend KDPS on their continued improvement in crowd communication. We saw that they have since the summer purchased new equipment for crowd communication. And we noted a very unique feature that I would like to highlight tonight, which is that they are using specialists from crisis intervention and hostage communication teams when they are crafting this new language to speak to the community. That's very unique, something very commendable. to your department in using specialized teams that have experience with using special language to communicate with crowds and with in high level and high intensity situations. I will turn it back to Steve. And if we can get the next slide, please, to talk about some use of force analysis.
So thank you, Teresa. And use of force was obviously a significant part of our mandate from the city in terms of our responsibilities. And so we took that very seriously. And one of the first things that kind of jumped out at us in the analysis was something that KDPS does not do, which we want to kind of affirm and commend. And because they don't do it, they avoided a lot of the more egregious mishaps that occurred in different parts of the country in response to some of the protest activity that occurred particularly during that late May, early June time period. And I'm referring specifically to the crowd management team and the department's decision not to utilize as a less lethal force option the baton rounds, they're called. They're kind of kinetic impact, less lethal rounds that are fired from a launcher and they're meant to, hit people in the chest as a torso area as a way of subduing them and kind of overcoming resistance. But unfortunately, we saw in several jurisdictions around the country that those kinetic impact projectiles in a very dynamic and sort of chaotic crowd situation could very easily end up going from striking someone in a safe part of the body to ricocheting or just directly hitting people in the eyes or other sensitive areas. And we saw numerous very, very serious injuries that obviously contributed to the overall concerns about law enforcement and community relations, and really was an example of how the enforcement strategies led to some very, very bad results. So kudos to KDPS and the city for deciding that was not a tool that they wanted to make use of. And I think that we certainly want to affirm that and hope that the city will maintain that posture going forward. So one of the challenges that we had, and again, this was not unique to KDPS in terms of the dynamics of the situation. The usual force reporting scenario is relatively straightforward because it's generally involving one subject who is in custody, and it's a lot easier for the department to investigate and take any photographs and get statements and really just kind of put a fence around what the use of force was, what the reason for it was, and what the department's reaction to it was. We saw some real deficiencies in reporting, particularly in the May-June time period. And in part, that was because oftentimes, or in fact, most times, when force was deployed, it didn't lead to an arrest, and you didn't have a particular person to tag the force to, and to get that person's version of events and to figure out exactly what happened. And we were particularly disappointed in the department's reporting process. Again, very challenging in terms of the volume of activity, and KDPS was certainly not alone among law enforcement agencies in having challenges in this regard. But one of the things we talk about in the report is it didn't seem like they started writing things up until, oftentimes a couple of weeks after the fact. The reporting was very, very vague and lacking in detail, and it made it difficult for us to judge the efficacy and legitimacy of the force that was used. Certainly contributing to that, or reinforcing those concerns and the challenges that we had, was the crowd management team's body-worn camera activation issues, which we also talk about. They certainly got that resolved in August, and by the time of the August 15th incident, and we had a lot of useful body-worn camera footage from officers that we could use to form our impressions. But there was a noticeable dearth of that material in the earlier time period. And we talked to the department about that, and they said that they were having, equipment issues with the gear that the crowd management team was wearing and equipping the cameras the right way, and just disappointing. It's the kind of thing that we think the department should have anticipated and worked around. And then we do consider, we were told by the department that their review of the uses of force, they found all of them to be justified and in policy. And we're not ruling out the possibility that that's accurate, but we certainly didn't have the evidence and the robust, thorough review process that would allow us to kind of corroborate that or be more comfortable with the department's ultimate findings in that regard. And we would encourage them to go back and look at some of those individual instances and individual episodes and see, you know, from an accountability perspective and also from a learning lessons perspective, could we be doing things differently or better? And we certainly focus on the report on a couple of deployments in particular. Jody, I just want to ask you real quickly if you could talk about the use of tear gas on the for the curfew enforcement on June 2nd, and what your thoughts were on that, and maybe most especially what some of the alternatives might have been to the use of force in that situation.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I think, you know, we saw nationwide there was a really broad use of tear gas to disperse crowds, and I think that unfortunately it was excessive. One thing that is starting to become more of a trend is to not use the tear gas, unless it's a situation where there's more of a violent issue going on or circumstances. When you have a crowd such as you had that day, I think that unfortunately, probably the best thing, unfortunately for law enforcement, I think sometimes we feel like we have to move people when we ask them to move, and instead of sometimes just staying there and waiting. At that point, the crowd, I believe, was pretty peaceful, and they were there to protest all the actions that were going on throughout the country. And unfortunately, it appeared that the use of tear gas was excessive, not only in Kalamazoo that day, but also on a number of occasions across the country. I know, for example, in Los Angeles, we haven't used tear gas in a crowd control situation since 1968. So, and we've had numerous protests and marches and things of that nature, similar to what happened in Kalamazoo in the past decade. So I think that maybe looking at the use of tear gas in crowd control situations would probably be something that would be good for the KDPS and the community to sit down and talk about.
Thank you, Jody. And I certainly want to be fair to the department in this public context as well as in the report. Some of the steps that they took, we actually think are very commendable. They use inert gas. Certainly there was, I certainly want to mention all the dialogue between the then assistant chief, city manager, and the protesters. We are absolutely supportive of those kinds of interactions. We think that they are a very positive and necessary step. And that dialogue, I think, was very constructive. But there came a point relatively quickly when it seemed like the department was saying, okay, enough of this, enough talk. The time for talk is over, and we need you to listen to us. And again, just based on the atmosphere in the crowd, the broad, wide police zone and restricted access, the situation was very much under control. And as Jody said, it might have been better to wait and to be slower about engaging and let the situation work itself out. And we also mentioned in the report, I mean, the environment there was, again, so relatively calm compared to the previous night that we even talked to people who were part of that crowd who said we were expecting to be arrested. That's part of what we wanted to do, is kind of engage in a classic civil disobedience, peaceful protest where we would get arrested to show, our rejection of the curfew concept and the enforcement that had been happening and the larger issues as well. And that, I think that might have worked well. There could have been a dialogue where they arrested X number of people in a very controlled, contained way. We saw that in other jurisdictions as well. And it might have avoided some of the optics that Jody's talking about, the 1960s protests where peaceful people are being chased down the street by geared up officers spraying tear gas at them. So we feel like that in particular was a place where the department's approach could have been different.
Steve, if I could add something else as well, kind of to piggyback on what Teresa and Julie mentioned, as well as you, like you said, there were a lot of great things that, quite frankly, KDPS did, specifically with the crowd management team. I think that if they continue to build on those successes and work closely with community leaders to discuss crowd management techniques moving forward, I think that would be a plus. I mean, some of the things that they did by focusing on some of the more violent protesters and the looters separately from the peaceful protesters was something that a lot of other agencies didn't do nationwide. As you all know, we saw that with some of the other reports that we've done. But that was something that was very commemorative of the CMT team and some of the things that they were doing early on that was better than other larger departments and even smaller departments nationwide.
Thank you, Jody. Next slide, please.
All right, now we get into the good stuff. We're finally there. So part of our scope of work was to look at each of these incidents through something called the equity lens. And for those who might not be familiar with that term, equity lens is essentially asking, were these events, so the decisions made, the underlying assumptions, the outcomes, were they equitable, okay? And in this particular context, one of the ways that we can evaluate that is through looking at data and doing data analysis. And that was in our very initial conversations with the committee that selected us, part of what we really were suggesting be done as a result of selecting us. Unfortunately, there was very limited data. And that is for a number of reasons, some that my colleague Steve just alluded to earlier related to the use of force reporting process. Some of that was specific to KDPS, and some of that was kind of the larger context of force in crowd management. So as Steve commented, there isn't necessarily a one-to-one force victim ratio with some of these incidents. And some as well was due to, statistically speaking, the numbers in your particular community were relatively low. And again, that's speaking from a statistical point, not attempting to discredit or not make account of the significance of those events in your particular city. But with that limited data, we can only do so much, right? And so our tests that we ran found no statistically significant findings of bias. And if your head is spinning by now, that's okay. My head sometimes spins at this stuff too. But essentially the takeaway from this is that the numbers, looking just at the numbers, didn't really tell us much, for better or worse. But one thing that we comment throughout the report is that looking at numbers alone is going to simplify all of those complexities of those days, right? And so our analysis, as we've displayed here and as we write in over 110 pages, goes so far beyond the numbers. And we evaluated conduct, background, planning, communication, all of the different features that KDPS did over the course of the summer. And what we discovered from that is that the outcome of the incidents contributed to a very real perception of bias and inequality. And so I'll say that again, because it is the perception of bias and inequality. And what we want to do with this particular report and with the work that we have completed is to look forward. So the recommendations that you see, the 40 plus, are deliberately inclusive. And we found that your city is already working on deliberately including equity lens as a piece of everything that they do. And so we commend your city for already engaging in that process, and we urge them to continue in doing so. I'll turn it back to Mike to have some closing comments about our recommendations, and then I think we'll have questions.
Thank you, Teresa. If we go to the next slide, thank you. Just to sort of close the loop on Teresa's comments on the equity lens. So because the data was so limited and because we couldn't come to conclusions, there is still, in our view, based on the individuals we talked to and getting to know your community at least as well as we could, considering the pandemic and not able to really come to Kalamazoo for these months, was that that perception that because of the way in which the Department of Public Safety decided to handle the Proud Boys visit and the resulting fact that, no Proud Boys were cited, arrested, or had any negative outcomes on that day, whereas a number of individuals who were counter-protesters did, left some with a perception that that there was some inequity going on there, particularly as a result of the stance that the Proud Boys have taken throughout this country. And so what we heard repeatedly was because many members of your community felt unsatisfied with the explanations for why this happened, why this dichotomy existed. Many were then reminded of the study that was done and commissioned by your city several years ago, when it was learned that based on that study, which was a more statistically significant and appropriate study that was specifically designed to take a look at differential conduct by your Department of Public Safety with regard to stops, that people were reminded of that. And the other thing that people were reminded of is that after the report came out, even though, as we comment in our report, I think for 2 or 3, 4 pages, how the chief at the time and the subsequent chief and the current chief have all continued this reform arc intended to address the disparities that were identified in that study. And there has been a lot of effort and resource investment by leadership of the Department of Public Safety with the support of the city in those areas, that because those efforts were not linked back to that report, that there wasn't a closure of that loop that was created by that report and the recommendations that came out. And so we think that that was the potential disconnect for why at least many members of the community still believe that that report came out and, quote, nothing was done. We heard this repeatedly, nothing was done in response to the findings, when in fact a lot was done. It just wasn't communicated in an effective way back to your community in 2014, 2015, and the years subsequent. Not unique to Kalamazoo, but certainly something that we found and felt it was important to comment on. The last piece that I wanted to talk about has to do with some schooling that we think could be helpful to the Department of Public Safety with regard to how to address future incidents. And there will be future incidents in which the Department of Public Safety is going to be challenged with regard to its response, whether that's a significant crime or series of crimes, whether that's a disaster, whether that is more protest activity or any kind of large scale event that must be planned for. That in our view, that when these things occur, because quite frankly, I don't expect the city to commission an outside group to come in every time there is a significant incident and independently conduct an after action. But what we think would be helpful would be for the Department of Public Safety, when these events occur, to step up and do its own objective, critical, and more holistic review of the way in which it responded to each challenge in a fulsome, in a holistic, and in a transparent way. And I want to make sure that people understand that we think that in doing that, it's important to frame the question appropriately. The question, in our view, should not be, what did we do right? What did we do wrong? With that dichotomy, but really should be more of looking back on this with the advantage of 2020 hindsight. Is there anything we could have done better? Is there anything that we would want to repeat on a forward-going basis and ensure that the good decision is exported back to the rank and file and first level supervision? If there are things we could have done better, how can we better prepare our agency to do better? Whether that is through organization, policy, guidance, training, all of the tools that any department has at its disposal. And then to report back to its public on steps that were taken with regard to this analysis in a transparent way, and acknowledgement of the issues in which KDPS decided that yes, there was room for improvement here, 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 and our self-assessment is we did pretty good here, here, and here. And I think if there is a one takeaway that I would like to ensure that the city be reminded of when we are no longer engaged with you, it's that sort of conceptual framework that we think was most important for any law enforcement agency in this century because of the increased demands for law enforcement by the community throughout this country. And in particular, your city has high expectations, and we hope and expect that by following that kind of guidance, that you will be able to meet those expectations in a better way. I think we can go to the next slide, please. I'm not going to talk about 1 and 2 because those are things that are already in the works. But the third piece is really where we hand off the project and the response and the responsibilities to the city and the Department of Public Safety and city leadership. And that is the implementation plan. We are not suggesting that everything that we do is exactly the way that the city should develop the concepts and the thoughts that we include in our recommendations. Those recommendations need to be customized for your city. They are a blueprint, but they are not the only blueprint. We recognize that. And quite frankly, we actually ended up with the easier part of the assignment, which is trying to explain what happened and trying to come up with ways to improve responses in the future. The much heavier lift is taking our recommendations and trying to make them into something actionable. And we understand that and recognize that. We go to the final slide, please. And to that degree, some are very easily accomplished. Some take a much longer sort of conceptual improvement arc. And the long-term considerations, for example, should, but even the short-term ones, but certainly the long-term ones should include involvement by your community, involvement by your city leadership, involvement by your elected officials, involvement by the Review and Appeals Board, and involvement by the rank and file and their leadership as well of the Department of Public Safety. And the final thing that I think is really important in 21st century policing is that all should be subject to a transparent reporting process so that the community realizes when changes are made that it's for what purpose it's being done and what is it intending to be responsive to. I wanted just to close here. And obviously our team is open and available to respond to any questions you all might have, by saying that we appreciated the privilege of being involved in this project. We think that probably because the report does take, I think, a realistic view of the nuances and challenges that the city and the Department of Public Safety faced last year, as did the rest of the country and the rest of policing in general, that there were things that it wasn't a question of all the things that KDPS did right or all the things that KDPS did wrong. That's not the framework, I think, in which one should consider. I think there are some in your community that would like us to have been more simple and said, KDPS was all wrong, KDPS was all right, but that's not how reality tends to be. And it's not that simplistic. So if those in your community are a little bit unhappy with some of the nuanced approach that we took in this report, we have to call it like we see it. We have to be objective, and we have to point out the nuances that creep into any kind of assessment of any magnitude. So with that, I am going to end our remarks so that we leave plenty of time for questions from the mayor, vice mayor, commission, and members of the appeals board. So I will hand that off to you all. Thank you very much for your time and patience while we walk through this presentation.
David Anderson here. Thank you so very much. And Chair Payne, I was going to make a couple comments, but I understand you want to say some things as well. So go ahead, please.
Oh, please. No, I defer to you.
Okay. So I just want to first ask Manager Ritzma, did you have anything else you wanted to add at this time?
No, Your Honor, other than just wanted to at some point jump in and especially that last slide, talk about next steps. So maybe get through the questioning and answering time, and then before we get to other comments, I could jump in at that point.
Okay, thank you, Manager Ritzma. So I just wanted to say, just representing the city and obviously this commission, I just wanted to thank the members of the OIR team who spent time putting this report together. And so Michael, Jody, Stephen, Teresa, and Julie, I really appreciate your efforts on that and your presence here today. Meaningful, very, I think a good overall view of this report, which is, as Chair Payne indicated, is much worthy of reading, and actually, even though it's 111 pages, it's very approachable and worthy of a serious evaluation and understanding. And I also wanted to thank members, including Chair Vernon Payne, but our DEI coordinator, Dorla Bonner, and Mr. Howell, as it pertains to the process of selecting this team that came in to do this work for us. So thank you for your efforts there. At this point, I know Chair Payne, you'll probably have some comments, but I guess just between the two of us here, we're just going to try to manage that opportunity for some specific questions from both of our boards. But I will turn it over to you, Chair Payne, at this time.
Thank you, Mayor Anderson. I want to make some brief comments. First, I want to acknowledge the frustration that some of our citizens feel, particularly the 4 citizens that called in. It's important to recognize, and I think this is captured in the report, that although there was no definable intentionality in terms of philosophy with agreeing with the Proud Boys, the outcomes that the citizens experienced sent a different message to them. They received that differently than was intended. That's the perception piece. I think it's very, very important for our citizens to understand that, like with the 2013 traffic stop, we now have these two situations documented by a third party. That will serve us well going forward as a community, because we can reference the comments and the evaluation and some data that was provided through this report. So I want to thank our 4 citizens for calling in and contributing to this discussion. At this time, we would like to open it up for comments or questions from the Citizens Board. Mr. Chamberlain, you might have to help me here, because I don't know if we're going to see all of the hands that are raised. It's a hand-raising process. So if any board member has a question or comment for OIR or others, please raise your hand.
I see Mr. Tolbert has his hand up, Chair Payne.
Okay, thank you. I don't see him on my screen. Mr. Tolbert?
Yes. As I read through this report, questions popped up in my mind, but as I continued reading, a lot of those questions were answered. The report was not one-sided. It wasn't totally in favor of the police officers or the community. One of the things I did want to bring up is that in this report, the pastor was pretty much vindicated as far as he was not the one who was leading the counter protesters in the violence that happened. As we know, when you get a couple hundred people, it's hard to control everyone. Many of us can't even control our kids from doing things. So people you don't know, and there was 3 different organizations there. I think it's a very important point that ORI brought up, that there were a lot of fingers pointed at the pastor as some of his online comments that were taken out of context. So when I read through the report, there were quite a few things on both sides. And as Chair Payne said, that when you're reading it, you have to ingest it. And I'm not going to make a whole lot of specific comments on it because I haven't digested it yet. So there's a lot of things in this report you're going to have to read through. And many of us just got it on Friday. So 100 and something pages of all of the work you all have done. I think it's a fair report, and that is my opinion of it. And I'm not asking anyone in Kalamazoo to forget what this community has gone through, not just in June and August, but for decades. That has happened, and Black lives do matter, okay? So what I'm saying is that don't forget anything in the past, but I think we have a new chief. A lot of these things are being put in place, and I think the community is moving in the right direction. That's all of my comment.
Thank you, Mr. Tolbert. Any?
Chairman Payne, I think Mr. Gardner had his hand up.
Thank you. Mr. Gardner?
Looks like his screen has frozen.
Mr. Chair, just a point of information, if you don't mind.
Yes.
I just wanted to make sure to clarify, it's my understanding that this portion is meant for questions and then there'll be a later opportunity for comments. I just want to make sure that we get both opportunities for those opportunities. So I just wanted to lift that up.
Thank you. This opportunity is for questions and comments as well, as I understand the agenda that I have in front of me here, and maybe that's not correct. C-SCRAB member comments after the 1 discussion items, which is a Q&A for OIR. Any other questions?
Do we get Mr. Gardner back?
I don't believe so, sir.
Any other C-SCRAM board member with questions or comments? Hearing or seeing none, I want to make one observation, one rather, I think, important observation. The OIR report harkened back to the 2013 traffic stop study. One of the key points in that traffic stop study was that our local police department have the ability to address culture and document the changes that were going to take place as a result of addressing the culture in the department. If I read OIR's report correctly, there was no data or information linking back to addressing the culture. And so fast forward to today. And I think that's principally why citizens don't feel that there was any progress made from that 2013 report. And so you fast forward today, and I believe it's on page 102, culture is significant in terms of how we all go about implementing policy and procedure. Because when it comes down to the citizens being on the receiving end of policing, culture does have an impact on the decisions that folks make with policy and procedure. And so I think one of the concerns is whether or not we go from 2013, a decade later, with the same way of policing with very few changes, when we have this report, and will anything change as a result of this report going forward? I think that's one of the concerns or fears that folks might have out there in our community. Okay. I'll turn it over to you.
I have one other thing since we're on the Citizens Review Board is my biggest concern, one of the biggest concerns I had was that, you know, if we're paying $75,000 for this report, why wasn't everything given to OIR by the police department and administration that they requested? I did not understand that.
There are several questions. Thank you for that question, Mr. Tolbert. There are several questions around that area. If you will recall, our board has requested data linking back to 2013 and years ago, and that data has not been received. If you recall, the Citizens Board requested data on all complaints given to the police department. Now, why was that important? And we requested this over a couple of years ago. That was important because if you're getting all that data, then you cannot take, as happened with these two incidents, 20 complaints and reduce it down to 6 or 1. You cannot take complaints in the Office of Professional Standards and turn that information over to a criminal investigation. So if we would have had that years ago, we would have had the ability to help our police department monitor that behavior. And so that's why I say I understand some of the frustrations that our citizens have, because I think our board has experienced some of those same frustrations in terms of how we get data and not having the ability to get the data turned over, which is what happened to OIR. Any other questions or comments before I turn it over to Mayor Anderson? Mayor Anderson, please.
I'm sorry, Mr. Payne, Chairman Payne, this is Jeff Chamberlain. I believe we have Mr. Gardner back on the phone.
Yes.
And so let me try to get him. Mr. Gardner, please go ahead. Mr. Gardner, are you able to go ahead with your questions or comments? It shows that he's connected, but I'm not sure why we can't hear him. Okay, we'll keep trying. I'm sorry, sir.
Mr. Anderson.
Wait, I'm sorry, sir. One other thing. Member Robertson has her hand up.
Yeah, thank you. So while I understand the limited scope of this evaluation, it presents a lot of questions in regards to general reviews of practices, policies, and procedures. So what does the evaluation process for these components look like annually? Given I share concern that a lot of the things presented here, like more so in the report concerning like reports, body cams, and the complaint process could be common practice. So can you share what the current evaluation process is for these processes? And I guess this would be more directed towards the city and KDPS.
Andrew Ritzma, would you like to field that, or someone on your team?
So that we're processing the report as you are and digesting it, and we're more than willing to provide that information. We're not prepared this evening to respond or to answer any of those types of questions, and we'll compile them and turn around and provide those responses as we have time to digest it and prepare those responses.
I appreciate that. I guess to provide just a little bit more clarity, I was talking about like the current processes that are put in place. So with an understanding that like the recommendations will obviously be embedded in those processes moving forward, but I guess I wanted to get a better understanding of the current process, if that's possible.
So the current process of the things that we put in place, how are we evaluating those? Is that?
Yeah, so evaluating like KDPS policies and procedures and practices.
Okay. Chief, do you want to jump in here and respond?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for that question, Board Member Robertson. I'm not sure I'm clear on your question, ma'am. Can I get a little bit more clarity to that?
Absolutely. So like, is there an annual review of policies and procedures? Like what's that process? And is there some level of audit in regards to practices? Just making sure that the practices are in line with the policies and procedures, and that the policies and procedures are going through some level of annual review.
Yes, thank you for that question. So yes, we do monitor our policies and procedures on almost a daily occurrence. And then at the end of the year, as you know, we do produce an end of year report with the Office of Professional Standards on those processes and policies and procedures, as well as use of force. And so we constantly monitor as our daily day-to-day operations. There comes a time when we find out a policy needs to be word changed, if you will, maybe broad, too broad, and we need to narrow that scope. So we do look at our policies almost on a daily occurrence as things come up and or issues with our organization. And so we look at those things to make sure that they're within good practices. As you know, we are currently have those standards right now. We are one of those agencies that have best practices in our policy, and we make sure that we're accredited for that. So those things are almost on a daily, but surely on a yearly basis. That's correct.
Thank you very much.
And Chairman Payne, I believe we have Mr. Gardner back on the phone.
Yes, you do. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'd just like to concur with Mr. Talbot. I think the OR group did a great job. I think it wasn't biased in any way. I think they was transparent on both sides. And moving forward, I love the recommendations that we can move forward. And I see changes now in the police department. So let's keep it moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gardner. I think that concludes our Q&A and comments, and so I turn it over to you, Mayor Anderson.
Thank you, Chair Payne. I appreciate that. Okay, so now is the time for commission questions and or comments. I have seen that Commissioner Urban did have his hand up, and then I see Commissioner Hess next. So let's start with you, Commissioner Urban.
Unmuting. Okay, I'm unmuted now, right?
Yes, we can hear you.
My main question is with regard to the cooperation that the city police force gave to OIR in complying with their requests. In some cases in the report, there was the word refused to provide documents. What I'm unsure about is, was it refused because they don't exist, or that they exist but weren't shared? There's a big difference between those two things. And I think the public and the commission needs to know some more clarification on what that form those refusals took, and some assessment of how serious that is, because it's one thing for what happened last summer to have happened, but to not be willing to learn from it, which looks like the impression I'm getting from some aspects of this report, is very disturbing. So if the OIR person is on the panel tonight can give me some clarity on what is meant by lack of forthcoming documents or refusal to turn them over means, I'd like to know that.
Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, Commissioner Urban, thank you for the question. I think there were a few things going on here. One is that we're living through a pandemic. We never got to Kalamazoo. And as a result, we didn't, I think we were challenged as everyone has been, with regard to the way in which we have to communicate with each other. And what I would say is that we're not persuaded that there were documents that existed that we weren't provided. What we were trying to say, as artfully as we could, is that it took us a while to get to where we wanted to get. So we'd make a request, and then it was only after a couple, 3 requests that we learned, for example, that the request for body camera footage that we had hoped to see in May and June, we weren't going to get, because there was no body camera footage, at least with regard to the crowd control unit, because they had not figured out a way, with one exception, most of them have not figured out a way to put the body cameras on their tactical gear in a way in which they could still record. It would have been helpful, as we indicate in our report, to have learned that right from Jumpstart, instead of after making a couple of requests for the information. So it was more of a halting process than we would have hoped it to have been. We again think that some of that may have had to do with the distance, the literal distance that we have had to live with in order to complete this project. And also I think this is probably, the first time, and maybe since the 2013 work that was done by the other group, since that KDPS was being asked to provide information, and that may have been some getting used to on their part as well. But we wanted to be as upfront with your community and with you as leaders to indicate that it wasn't as seamless as ideally we would have hoped it would have been. We don't believe that there were documents that were hidden from our view. That's not the perception that we want to give you, but it just took, the process took longer in our view than perhaps it could have been.
Thank you, Michael. Commissioner Urban, another question?
Yes, just follow up. Well, another aspect back to that was the after action reports. In some cases they weren't turned over, or if they were even prepared, they were prepared late, or they were too vague to be useful. So is that a fair assessment?
Most of what you said is a fair assessment. So we didn't see, as I think Mr. Connolly, my colleague, indicated in his remarks, we didn't see a robust evaluation of uses of force that occurred in May, June, and in August. It's not unique to Kalamazoo, but here's one of our key recommendations, Commissioner Urban, which is when a protest is coming, when you know there's going to be several hundred people out there, or at least you have a belief that that is going to occur, that during the planning and operations that we commented credibly about and positively about, that one component of that planning should be, if we are required to use force, how are we going to document it? If we are going to potentially introduce gas, how are we going to inventory it so that we know after the fact who deployed the gas, when, where, who authorized it? If we are going to use any other kind of force, how are we going to ensure that that gets captured? And one way to do that in a mass arrest or mass crowd control situation is to take advantage of the body cameras. But that wasn't carefully thought through in the sense that the people that were on the front line of some of these responses didn't even have them on in late May and June for a couple of days. And so that information is now missing, or it was never captured. In our view, the importance of body cameras and their preeminence in capturing information should have been first, front, and center with regard to the operations plan as they were figuring out how to deploy in late May and early June.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Commissioner Urban. Commissioner Hess.
Hi, Jean Hess here from City Commission. City Manager Rissima, you had commented that we will be getting a report about how we've digested all of this information and how we're going to be moving forward. I'd like to leave this evening with a timeline for that report. And whether it's going to be in 2 weeks or 2 months, I'd like to be able to do that so that, as some of the callers have asked for, that we hold each other accountable for making that happen. So do you have that in mind at all?
Sure, I can jump in here, Commissioner Hess. So the way we're looking at it right now, and just to go back to how I responded to Member Robertson, we'll compile questions that were raised tonight, and we will send a response to both the City Commission and to CSPRAB members. And I would think we would be able to, it's Tuesday now, by the end of next week, we should be able to have that. At the same time, I'd like to put out a timeline with milestones, much like we did when we did the action plan from last year. In fact, that's a model I'd like to use in how we approach, working with this OIR report and the recommendations and tracking and all of that. And so we can provide that at the same time. The way I view it right now is, there's going to be a period of time for digesting and understanding and, maybe working back and forth with OIR to understand things more or whatever. And then having from that, how we're going to move forward. We definitely want to involve the community as we move forward and how we show our progress in this and also lean on them to help us be better. I think that's going to be a part of that. And then I envision sometime later this year, coming back with what you just mentioned as like the plan and how we're going to, with recommendation A, response A, and how we're going to track it, and do that for all 40, and then have a mechanism to do that, and use that as a way of being transparent, but also reporting, progress and the like to the public and to the both boards. Maybe we even want to consider a smaller committee of CSBRAD members and commission to help work with, like we did with the subcommittee last year, to work with us in, developing that. So we're making sure we're, hitting the mark as far as expectations go. So, some of those things is also what I'm thinking.
Thank you for that. And I wonder if there could, in addition to a co-working committee, if we could have another committee of the whole that includes the CSBRAD committee.
For bringing that information back?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sure we can arrange for that.
Thank you, Commissioner Hess. So I am looking for more questions. I see Commissioner Pradel.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So just had a couple questions here. This first couple are for Mike and your team from OIR. The first one is just basically, it heard from some feedback from residents just over some concerns about whether there was anything lost because OIR group, your representatives weren't able to come to City of Kalamazoo. You spoke a little bit about that before, but in your honest assessment and opinion, do you feel that there was anything substantively lost by having, the virtual public input sessions versus being in person, or, not having that direct face-to-face interaction and content here in Kalamazoo?
It's a great question, Commissioner. I think that it would have been helpful to be able to come to Kalamazoo for a couple reasons. Although the virtual platform is, I think, always going to continue to be with us as an alternative way of getting information, because for some individuals, it's easier to participate in civics, if you will, remotely than it is to come to a space in which, it's more trouble. And it also, for those who are cautious or concerned, to be able to do it remotely is in some ways more facile and more comfortable for some. A hybrid would have been ideal. But the other thing that we would have liked to have done is when we met with you, when we met with other commissioners, when we met with city leadership, and when we met with the Department of Public Safety, to have a meeting across the table instead of in these, little squares remotely, I think would have been certainly more effective. The final thing that we always like to do, and we weren't able to do here, although the body camera footage and the media footage, et cetera, did sort of fill in, but we would have liked to have walked the route, taken a look at the park, and eyeballed some of these significant parts of your city that come into play here. And to do that remotely is not as effective as actually walking those streets.
Well, I hope next time you guys are in the neighborhood that you make sure to swing by Kalamazoo. We got some pretty awesome things here to enjoy.
I hear now the mosquitoes are overwhelming, but I hear the fall is a great time.
It is a great time. So that
If I may jump in really quickly and just express that I certainly absolutely agree with everything that Mike has brought forward, but I do want to comment that we received so much correspondence from your community. And so I think that the opportunity for people to correspond with us via email, via Zoom, via phone calls, encouraged people who may not have otherwise spoken up to do so. And I would like to just express how grateful we are to everyone in your particular city who came forward to speak with us. We had an extraordinary response from the people of your city. And so we are grateful for those perspectives that they provided.
Sure.
David Anderson, just going to jump in here. So please, just because we're on Zoom and not everybody can see the camera, just identify yourself when you do speak. So Tracy, you want to go ahead? Just
Sure. Yes, sorry about that, Mayor Anderson. Yes, Teresa Magula with OIR Group.
Thank you so much. Commissioner Pradel.
Thanks. This Chris, again, Commissioner Pradel. So the second question I have for you as well along those lines is, I was trying to think back, and one of the things that I've always been schooled in like management is that, feedback is very important, that it's timely, right? That it's in real time, you get it as quickly as possible so that person can, change behaviors before things happen again. Or, we could have very well had prolonged unrest or protest later in the year. And, I was thinking back about possible things that were causing the delays, to get this ball rolling. And I was thinking, well, we knew we were going to do an independent review. Then August 15th happened, right? So then now August 15th is now included into the investigation. Certainly the pandemic plays a role in that as well, in terms of planning and coordinating and all those sort of things as well. But do you think, in your assessment and advising us for the future and these sort of things, do you think it would have been more important to be more timely and do this sooner? What does a typical timeline look for a community? Is this out of the ordinary? Or is it okay that it's, a year past this, as long as we're, examining what happened and trying to, address how to improve things in the future?
Yeah, Commissioner, again, the timing of it all, you are sort of in the middle of the pack with regard to responding and sort of rolling it out and doing the RFP. I think that the deliberation that your deciding group on the selection process, I think all that is important, and you don't want to rush through it. On the other hand, you do want timeliness. What I would say is this, and this did exist in your city, and that is, while you were commissioning this sort of Uber study, this greater, larger after action report with a lot of expectations, you weren't sitting on your hands. There was the subcommittee, as we indicate in our report, KDPS did their own review and did come up with some solution pieces. And so I think, while I am not as concerned that we're not even a year out, August 15th hasn't even happened again. So we're in some ways in better shape than many cities. We still have some outstanding projects for cities that have had even a longer time frame. That as long as the city continues to do what it should be doing anyway, and not waiting for that report to be dropped, I think that's fine. I don't know that the delay was unnecessarily extended.
Next question I had for you was in terms of communication. And, obviously you see a lot of these scenarios, oftentimes they're in crisis situations. It's very difficult to assess being thorough. And, in my assessment, in my role as commissioner, I think, especially under the Thomas administration, with KDPS, she was very, very thorough. And, Chief Coakley, you're very, very thorough. Your teams really want to make sure that they have all the facts gathered and, are thoughtful in making sure that they're giving people the full picture. But I think oftentimes that can come at the absence of, giving people information in real time and, sharing when people are just like thirsty for that information. They want to know what's going on. And, I felt that as a commissioner, so I can only imagine what, the public felt, trying to figure out what's going on as well. And so, I think I can understand seeing from administration's perspective of what's going on behind the scenes, because they're really trying to paint a really strong picture for what's happening and make sure that they're ready to respond. How do you recommend that, in the future, we balance those kind of situations in terms of scenarios like the real-time response, like in that moment as it's happening, how should we be responding? In the short term, like the next day, what should be the response? And in the long term, what should we be doing to make sure that people are getting updates that are informative?
I'm
Mike
sorry, Michael,
Chinako
just
again.
make sure you introduce yourself just so people, yeah.
I thought I just did that, Mayor. I was on
Oh, I'm
it.
sorry. I recognize your voice. Okay, good.
No, I was on it. Mike Chinako, in responding to Commissioner Pradel's question. This is like $1 million question here, because one of the challenges that is increasingly being faced by city leadership and public safety as well is the balance and the competing interests in getting it right and getting it out. And with the increased compression of that media cycle, where almost immediately people are communicating on social media and otherwise about information in real time, it has become even more and more difficult to accomplish that. I think, Commissioner Pradel, one of the consequences of the events from last summer, and I think it's a positive one, is the devotion of time and understanding of the need to have more focus on communication strategies and the creation of a PIO and all of that, I think, will put the city in a better stead as future crises occur. But it's always going to be a competing balance. I would say very briefly a couple of things. One is, to the degree you're putting out information, one thing is, in the interest of putting it out quickly, you have to be absolutely, to the degree at all possible, that the information you're putting out is accurate. And if you have any doubt about its accuracy, don't put it out. And I think that is where we have seen in other jurisdictions, particularly where information like after a critical incident that has the public's consciousness regard to, let's say, an officer-involved shooting or a deadly force incident, where interest is high and there have been missteps in how information is put out that end up creating a whole level of additional distrust. And it's that information that is inaccurate that is put out that then becomes the story rather than the incident itself. So I would suggest that it's important to get out information quickly, but it has to be accurate. And I would sacrifice the timing to make sure you got it right.
Thank you, Mike. This is Commissioner Chris again. So another question I had for you, just in your opinion, you know, I've heard, I think one of the callers called about this as well. You know, it's saying, well, this independent investigation pretty much told us what we already knew and those sort of things. But, you know, I think there were a number of us on commission who were, you know, clamoring for this from pretty much from the get-go. And part of it, I think, is because I think we recognize that it's part of the healing process, you know, that we needed to take this process to like hear each other and you know, listen. But also, you know, that at the end of the day, like, you know, whether it's a commissioner, whether it's the public safety chief, whether it's the city manager, you know, we're in this, right? And so to have, you know, an expert in the field and somebody who's a third party intermediary to, you know, kind of call you out on all segments, you know, the good, the bad, the ugly, is pretty important to the healing process. So could you share a little bit about that, you know, like maybe what it would look like in a community if we had done this internally, you know, and how that can, you know, impact outcomes, if you will.
Michael Giannacco responding to Commissioner Pradel's question, Mayor Anderson. How am I doing?
Great.
So, yeah, what I would say is one, I think there is new information in this report because we were learning information as we wrote it that did not appear from the initial information we received. Just as an example, I think the report indicates, I think for the first time in a public document, that for a couple days, the crowd management team didn't have body cameras on their gear. And that's one of the reasons that there's not a lot of video footage from those first 2 days of protest. But I think the larger aspect of what we hope to do was to take the information, much of it that was already known and had been reported on, and not put it in a news article, but put it in context of the larger framework in which all this happened, and to try and tell the story in an explanatory way to provide that what we think is important context. One, recognizing the challenges, but two, identifying things that went well and things that could have been better. And I think that if you do that internally, that it doesn't have that same level of credibility, because people feel that people that are within the organization, within the city family, if you will either consciously or subconsciously place their thumb on the scale one way or the other. And we don't have that investment. We don't have that connection. We don't live in Kalamazoo. But what we tried to do was take all we learned from Kalamazoo leaders and residents and synthesize that as outsiders in some sort of framework that would make some sense and provide some context.
Thanks, Mike. This is Commissioner Chris again. Just got a couple of things here. I just wanted to make sure to make a response as well to Member Robertson, because you had asked the question, what the review of progress had been made, and I think there might have been a good response too that I think is important to that for the public to hear. I just jotted down some things that I think that we are monitoring and will continue to monitor. So one of them is that we formed a subcommittee based on communication strategies in the fall of 22 with Vice Mayor Commissioner Cunningham, and I were on that, and put together a number of proposals in terms of communication, and a lot of those had some action items that we wanted to follow up on. C-SCRAB itself, there were recommendations on oversight and internal review that did not exist prior to last June. The city manager put out a plan that included a lot to do with trainings, and including a citywide equity audit of all people who work for the city of Kalamazoo. We've had a number of DEI advances, including that audit, but it included just having a DEI department in general and a manager at our leadership table, but also recently Dorla Bonner hired an assistant, Tanessa as well, that expanded that department. I know that there's been a number of hiring practices change with KDPS, and I know Chief Coakley has been very committed to that, and especially trying to be much more visible and in the community when it comes to hiring periods. And so, those are just a few things that I know that I've just been privy to, that I know are going on, that I know are being monitored. So, the list of 40 recommendations, whatever we do with these, which I hope, are cataloged and followed up on and whatnot, is just a growth beyond that list of things as well. So I just wanted to make sure to mention those as well, because I think it's important that we talk about those, not to mention the fact that we have a new chief. We have a new head in the department in leadership who is charged with DEI, that works with the standards. And it's for the first time ever, we actually have Victor Green, who is the person that does that work, corresponding and working with Dorla Bonner's team. So we have one Kalamazoo directed at strategy for DEI for the first time ever in the city of Kalamazoo. We've hired a public information officer. We've hired a community collaborator. And at a couple of commission meetings ago, we hired a social services coordinator for the first time in KDPS. So, I really struggle sometimes, when people say that we haven't done anything, because there have been significant steps, and I would charge anybody to take a quick Google search on any comparable city of our size or that had the challenges that we had last year, that have done more to step up in such a short amount of time. And then, it would be very easy for us to say we're going to charter a report and then just hope people forget about it, right? But here we are over a year later, still having this conversation to try to make ourselves better. I think, as an observation for me, that we can dwell on this forever and keep digging ourselves in the mud and pointing fingers, but at the end of the day, this community is only going to move forward if we recognize the pain and hurt and trauma that was created to the events from last year, that we reach out our hands to each other and work together. That includes with public safety, and recognize the challenges that they face and the challenges of this time that they face, and try to work together to come up with solutions so that we have the most impressive safety record of any community in this nation. And until we get to that point, which we got a long ways to go, I hope we continue to work together at that. So anyways, that's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Pradel. Vice Mayor, other commissioners have questions or comments? Vice Mayor Griffin.
Thank you, Mayor Anderson. So I do have a couple questions and a couple comments, and I'll probably just mix it all in there. My first question was this report made available in other languages? That was my first question.
Vice Mayor Griffin, as far as I know, it has not yet been translated into other languages.
Okay, thank you for that. Vice Mayor Griffin here. We need to make sure that's immediately translated initially in Spanish, and we need to make sure it's available in a host of other languages ASAP. Because as we're having this conversation, we have already left out a population in our community who hasn't been able to access it. So we have to start there. So a couple other comments I have. So Commissioner Urban, I appreciate you trying to get clarity with respects to what information was or was not shared. And so, Michael, I know you were attempting to provide some clarity on that, but I'm still unclear. And so I agree with some of the comments that have been made. If our community gave 100% and showed up 100% through all of the ways that were accessible to them, then as a city, we are responsible for showing up 100% as well. And I would like clarity on what specifically was requested and what was not received. And if there's maybe 5 items, if that would provide clarity for me at least where we're at with that information. And so is that something that you all could provide in a relatively short amount of time?
Vice Mayor Griffin, we could, although I would say this, the report does not indicate that we were refused information. What the report talks about is the process of requesting information and sort of the intricacy of getting that information. So we do not have at this point a belief that there was, some smoking gun document that was declined based on our inquiry. It just took us a while to get the information that we had asked for. And that, if you go through our report, we don't indicate if we had been declined a report that we knew existed, then we would have said as much. But that's not the case.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for that clarity. This is Vice Mayor Griffin speaking again. And so just a couple comments that I have to Commissioner Pradel's point, what if we had listened to community in the first place? I think a lot of what is included in this report, and I do agree with Chair Payne that it needs to be reviewed multiple times. But a lot of what we have seen is what we've already known. And so what are we going to do moving forward, listening to the community? And my initial thoughts right now, specifically as it relates to tear gas, even after hearing that being lifted up in this, I know this isn't the proper venue for that, but we should be looking at getting tear gas off the table sooner than later. The community spoke heavily to that already. It was something that was lifted up in this report. And I just want to make that specific point known. And I guess some of the other thoughts that I'm having right now, relate to accountability. And so we have a situation that took place over a year ago under leadership that is no longer here anymore. So how does that get accounted for? Yes, Chief Coakley is responsible for what we do as we move forward, but he was not the chief at the time. Although he was assistant chief and was very present, he was not the chief. So how do we reconcile the accountability that lies with what took place under this report? And I would say that responsibility lies with the city manager and with us as a commission, as we were the constants in this entire process. And so what are we going to do moving forward in that accountability space? And hopefully, as Commissioner Hess asked earlier, we can have a committee of the whole meeting and really dig down into this. What I don't want to see happen is a repeat of what happened in 2013. As was lifted up in some of the comments that took place, our community, the The process is as such, you know, people who are closest to the issue, they are very clear on what has happened. They voice their opinions loud and clear. They don't get heard. Data has to be collected, reports get received, and then nothing happens. And so while I do appreciate that there have been certain steps that have been taken to make some progression, it's not been enough. And so we have to be very intentional, very clear, in order to make sure that what happens with this report is not a repeat of 2013. And that won't happen without very specific, very clear goals, dates, deadlines that shouldn't be dragged out, you know, another 60 days, 90 days. It shouldn't take that long. We've had a year to sit with this. We've had a year to, you know, we shouldn't be starting now with, you know, figuring out what we're going to do. We should have already been thinking about that. And so those are my initial comments. I'm sure, you know, as I continue to take this in, I will have more. But this is where I'm at right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice Mayor Griffin. Commissioner Cunningham, do you have any questions or comments you wanted to make?
Technical difficulty there. Commissioner Urban, did you have a question?
I had. You go ahead, because I've already used up some of my time. I'll come back after others have talked or asked.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I don't want you to lose your thought.
Yeah.
Doubling down on Vice Mayor's last statement about accountability and responsibility. You know, there's a lot of responsibility as it pertains to the city commission. When this all took place, a lot of people say, oh, let's blame the mayor. Yeah, the mayor has some responsibility, but it's 7 people that have the same power to vote and to move agendas and to be a part of that leadership and that decision making. And our job is to hold the city administration accountable for their actions and for the things that they do, and to measure their outcomes and make sure that we're providing a great product as a community. So I just wanted to, one, put a pin in that to say, you know, as an educational point for the community, that it is your responsibility to continuously hold us accountable. And that doesn't just mean at the polls. That means, hey, did this get done? In a month, if you haven't heard anything, hey, did this get done? Hey, did this get done? And then us as leaders, as to the city commission, it is our responsibility. Prime example is the 2013 report. Yes, 2 chiefs prior to did not make it a priority. Hopefully Coakley does, to follow up on that. And yes, we had 1 city manager who was there through the whole process, didn't make it a priority to follow up on that. And I'm included. This is my 2nd term that didn't make it a priority to follow up on that. And that was unacceptable. And so that's something that, you know, we don't have to wait for the community to say what's going to ask that question. I know specifically that I've been having tension with trying to get an understanding of what we're doing to improve with KDPS. And mind you, I'm closer to what KDPS is doing, and I know a lot of the things that we're doing to change our culture. I know a lot of the things that have changed to improve our culture. But let me digress. I'm sorry, I get on the soapbox, those who know me. First of all, I want to say to the community, this presentation was a short overview of the document. And if you read the document, there's a lot of more details within there. And so if you have questions, please call into the city 311 and ask. And we will make sure that city will at least try to get information out to you as soon as possible about your questions. Also, a disclaimer. This one is more so to our city staff and public safety employees. Stay encouraged that as a team, we'll be successful as a community. In most places of employment, upper management will be having this meeting behind closed doors. Unfortunately, the commission and CSPRAB, we do not have that luxury. So we have to have this conversation in front of a lot of individuals, asking these questions, providing these thoughts that may be naive or maybe things just have to be said out loud and asked in real time. And then for OIR, as it pertains to this document, I think you guys did a pretty good job encompassing a lot of things. My critique, or what I would have been looking for, is that I think this document could have been a little more impactful, providing strictly facts for the incidents and then provide opinion. It felt more like the entire document felt more like an overview instead of the structure of what I would consider qualitative data analysis report. But into my questions for the OIR team. On page 21, and I quote, KDPS, the target specific arrest strategy that they used backfired to some extent. Obviously unaware of the warrant, the crowd challenged the legitimacy of the arrest and were further incited by police efforts. What I wanted to know was, did that statement or feeling or sentiment come from someone in the community, or did that come from somebody in the city administration?
Hello there.
This,
Mike,
go
I
ahead.
can respond to that. This is Steve Conley from OIR Group, and thank you for the question and the comments. We did get feedback from the community relating to that issue and the concerns that people had who were out on the streets that evening. And in their presentation that the KDPS gave us, they also bookmarked that particular issue as a place where a lot of the energy changed, because and they acknowledged that the crowd was very agitated and upset by the arrest and the circumstances of focusing on that particular individual. He was not actively doing anything, obviously disruptive, criminal at the time that he was taken into custody. And there were a lot of people out in the street who see a Black man who is out as part of the protest, all of a sudden surrounded by officers and struggling. And it was certainly something that was inflammatory in terms of the energy of that evening. And so we actually heard that from a few different places, but some of that included KDPS itself in their presentations to us.
Okay. On page 36, it states that city officials decided to impose a curfew for accountability purposes and independent findings. Can we get clarity as a commission on the process of that decision and who made that decision? This is one of the questions that we heard loud and clear from the community. And I'm not sure if you have that on hand right now, but that's something that I would like to be included in the official document. And then my last question to you guys directly, clearing the park and establishing a police line happened at the Proud Boys protest. And I heard it also happened at the Bronson Park when projectiles were sent into the crowd, but I didn't see that in this document. Was there not enough data to speak to that? Was that one of the times where, I know that was the night where there wasn't much body cam footage, but it wasn't really in the document and didn't go into detail. And I know that that was a major thing that I heard. And it's not necessarily concerning the individuals who were kneeling down. We caught that on video, but the park, and this is why I kind of wish you guys were on the scene, but the park behind the building that structure that incident happened, there were young individual, college kids, individuals like that who are stating to me, hey, we had these projectiles, we had these gas shot at us, and we weren't doing anything. We weren't aware of anything. And obviously, I can understand and attribute it. I can understand the response or excuse that you guys kind of built in there. I won't use the word excuse. The response was that, there was aggression, the shots was fired. Unfortunately, the communication between the party of the aggressors and the party of those who weren't aggressors was not there. But I wanted to know if you guys had more information around that. And if you didn't, was it due to the lack of video?
So I can speak to that question also, and thank you. Again, it's Steve Conley from OIR Group. And yes, you're absolutely right. That is actually something we heard about from a few different sources as being a specific source of contention from people who were out in the street Monday. And our understanding is that part of the genesis for the organized protest movement on Tuesday night, the curfew violation, kind of the knowing, willful curfew violation standoff that occurred at that intersection, was a function of people who were responding to the sense that they had been engaged in appropriate behavior on Monday night, First Amendment, legitimate protest. And we did hear some of those same descriptions from people who were actually involved, and again, third parties who had heard it secondhand or witnessed it on social media or something, and it was a source of concern. I will tell you that, yeah, we did look at their arrest report documents that made reference to Bronson Park and the particulars of that, but that is absolutely an area where we would have liked to have had a more complete picture, because some of these circumstances, it's like you may have a group of people and it's, 9/10 of them are behaving appropriately, and one of them is throwing a frozen water bottle at a line of officers, and it can engender reactions that are confusing to some, but appropriate for the officers in terms of officer safety. And what all the reports were consistent about saying is that they were giving orders. They were tried to be clear to people that they were obligated to leave the park, and there was definitely some miscommunication or misunderstanding there. And again, a certain amount of assaultive behavior, allegedly, that we weren't able to verify, but was part of the KDPS justification for what occurred.
Yep. So can I also ask that be added into the document, pretty much stating that these were some of the complaints from the community in this Bronson Park area, yet there's not enough video verification to understand what really took place. And I asked that for my colleagues. I asked that because, in 10 years, I won't be probably the main one looking back on this, and I don't know where I'll be in this process. So if individuals need that information for context, I think it would be important. Point of clarity again, Mayor Anderson, will we get an opportunity to have comment after this, or is this kind of opportunity, or is this our time to give question and comment?
Yeah, David Anderson here. So that's a good question. I think we were thinking about separating the question, the comment piece, but seems to me we've ended up blending that together. So, I mean, if you want to set aside a time for that or reserve your comments for later, I'm fine with that. Or if you just want to do it all now, it seems like that's how it's going.
Yeah, and I can give them. I'll try and be brief and short. On page 33, it states strong fundamentals, effective supervision, but mixed results. It also states in there, quote, there is strong, clear decision-making. One of the things I will never, probably haven't seen as it pertains to KDPS is a lack of being organized. Their chain of command is, one that, I don't think that we've had a large scale failure, something that we see as a systematic problem. So I want to commend our officers and their structure for that. Two other things that I want to talk to, and I don't necessarily think that they needed to be in the document, but I think both bodies need to hear, and it's more of Eric Cunningham testimony on some things that I saw, some things that I feel. What was not mentioned in this document, but page 12 talks about the day of the curfew and those who were arrested and those who were gassed. I want to say that the spirit of our ability to enact a curfew should have been executed as a cautionary measure for our citizens versus a mandate for our citizens to stay at home. I say that because it was the day after when I was being debriefed, and it was to my understanding that we had individuals that we arrested. And when those individuals were arrested, we had to make a determination on whether we're pressing charges, whether we're not, things of that nature. When I say we, I should say city administration, and that power structure, because I'm not in that decision. I'm not in that decision making at all. But that was a time where our city attorney informed us that the way that ordinance is written up is meant, the spirit of that ordinance is to be cautionary, not a mandate. So on that day, I received tons of communication from people in the community asking me, am I allowed to go to work? Can I go to the grocery store? Can I go to the park? Things of that nature. And for me, my personal opinion is that we need to be clear on how we communicate that so that people understand, yes, you can still go to work under a curfew. Yes, you can still ride your bike under a curfew. It's a cautionary that there's danger in the community. So we advising you, we're telling you, we're absolving ourselves of liability, but at the end of the day, you should still be allowed to go and do those things. That being said, please still understand that yes, our KDPS, our public safety, will be at a heightened sensitivity and at the point that a curfew is enacted, and that anyone who violates the law, you should expect to be, questioned, apprehended, whatever that process may incur. So I just wanted to really highlight that and that those individuals who were released and arrested and released, that was a part of my frustration, in that I don't think that our officers were carrying out the true spirit of that curfew. The other piece is the equity lens. The OIR may not have been able to make an assessment in this because of the small amount of data that we charged them with collecting. But the statistics and benchmarks of continued failure by our policing in our community didn't start last year. And I won't even just say policing. I'll say city administration and city commission. I want to repeat our benchmark, whether OIR says there is an equity problem or not, there is one there. And if anyone believes differently, I would ask yourself to question whether you're desensitized to the cries of a community, or if it's something that your standard is just low to the point where what I consider bias is allowed. That being said, I look at the Proud Boys incident, and for me, my apologies. For me, the Proud Boys incident was very evident and very clear on a bias. And my statement, you can take it for however you want, but there's a fact within this statement. The fact is, KDPS determined that that area, that site, was unsafe. And the fact is, when they determined it was unsafe, they only sent certain people home and they only arrested certain individuals. I think for me, that is very clear, in that what I'm looking for is firm. I want our police to be firm, fair, and consistent. We got that firm part pretty good, but we have to be fair and we have to be consistent. And I think when we start hitting that mark of fairness consistently, that's when we're going to start building that trust. That in communication were the two biggest pitfalls that we ran into last year. I will honestly say, since we have our new chief, he has been a godsend on information. We get it almost as real time, and it's practically on spot every single time. So I appreciate that. But that being said, we have to intentionally communicate. And I'm a double down on Commissioner Prado's statement. It's got to be before, during, and after. And I want to double down on the OIR's recommendation. Don't give information if it isn't completely 100% true as based on what the information that you have. It has to be, but get that information out as soon as possible. That information could be, hey, we don't have any information. It can be that, but at least communicate consistently, as Commissioner Prado would say. I'm not seeing too many times where over communicating was an issue. And so I just want to double down on those two items, that communication and some of those built-in biases that we can rectify. I think based on a lot of the recommendations that were made by OIR gives a lot more clarity, because as my colleagues mentioned, there's a subcommittee and we did some work, but I think I would have been better equipped to do that work with this information that I now have, because you don't know what you don't know. And I'm not an expert at policing. I can just go based upon what I see, what I feel, and the years of experience I have serving as a commissioner and or engaging with our public safety. And so I look forward to the work. I look forward to the journey. Next steps has to be follow up. I know that Commissioner Hess has asked for a timeline. I would ask for that timeline to be, let's get some of the meat and potatoes done before I'm done in November, so that I can be well ingrained in it, get a clear understanding, and then, my responsibility will be to educate our next commissioners, mayor and vice mayor, on where I think we should go with this process, what took place, and how we can improve and collectively do better. I want to also highlight the importance of CSPRAB. It was mentioned in this report that they should be an integral piece in the review of policy and procedure. And they also mentioned the community at large, but they specifically stated their name in this document. So I wanted to highlight that. I also wanted to highlight the importance of, to my colleagues again on this platform, to say the union contracts are coming up really quick, and it is our opportunity to educate ourselves and to see if any of the things in this report may have been impacted by that document. I don't know, but that's something we should be able to answer. And so I look forward to the journey. I look forward to the work. I thank you all for your servitude. I thank you all for who worked on this document. And I look forward to the updates. As far as accountability, I think when down the line, when City Manager Ritzma and Chief Coakley come to us with the things that's changed, and obviously now that they have this document, they can provide some more recommendations on what they would like to see changed. And then we can have a deeper dialogue from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Cunningham. Commissioner Urban?
Yes, I have a specific question directed to OIR Group. I noticed that very little was said about the advisability of calling in the National Guard after Monday night and having them be present in camouflage and in military style vehicles on the city streets on Tuesday. I think the city would like to have some a national perspective on how appropriate it is to call in the National Guard, and what your assessment was of the appropriateness of that, and advice that you may give to us about when to involve them in the future and how to communicate that with the public. I think that there was a a missed opportunity in your report to cover that. And I hope we can still correct that. Because on Tuesday, frankly, the crowd was pretty calm, except the thing that was really bothering them was the presence of the National Guard. That was just like waving a red flag in front of a bull. But yet there was no mention of that in the OIR report. So I would say thank you to all of you for your national perspective that you brought to your investigation. But we missed an opportunity to get some clarity on that point. And if you can provide it later, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you. This is Michael Chinaco, responding to Commissioner Urban's comment and question. There is a passage, a piece about the National Guard in the report, and there is a recommendation relating to the National Guard. And if I can paraphrase in just a few seconds, what is said about the National Guard is that the very competing considerations that you identify did exist with regard to that decision, and then where to place them. I think the fact is that there was some credence to calling for them, in the sense that by that time, KDPS was feeling strapped with regard to resources. They were feeling spent with regard to resources. They had taken advantage of their mutual aid and gotten other agencies to assist. But by placing the National Guard where they were, it allowed KDPS to continue to provide the crowd control necessary as the protests went on and on and on. On the other hand, Commissioner Urban, your point about the concern of having military type individuals in your city deployed on street corners is the competing consideration. And so that is why our recommendation suggests that that as you move forward, that there be more consideration about considering these competing considerations and coming up with a strategy and some guidance to your leadership about when you call them.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Commissioner Cunningham.
Then could we at least ask for clarity within the document on the decision making and the process of that to have them come?
Michael Chinaco responding to Commissioner Cunningham. Yeah, if it's not clear as to who called them in our report, we can provide that clarity.
Yeah, if I may, this is Teresa Magula from the OIR group. In our section related to the National Guard, we note that the chief at the time requested the assistance of the National Guard. So she was the individual who called for that resource to respond to Kalamazoo.
Commissioner Cunningham.
This is Commissioner Cunningham. I think what it was more so that timeline and what does that look like? So when you request that, are you requesting that to, I don't know who we requested that to. And so I think that's more so the inquiry on when was that decision made? Was it made on Saturday? I think it alludes to it being made, you know, the night after a lot of the things that took place, and I'm pretty comfortable. I know kind of where that fits into everything on that Tuesday, but I would like just for that to be added in for clarity and so that people understand who made what decision when, if that makes sense.
So at this point, I'm looking to see if there's any other comments or questions from Vice Mayor or commissioners. I'm not seeing further hands at this point. Chair Payne, do you want to see if there's any final comments or questions from the public Citizen Public Safety Review and Appeal Board.
Yes, and thank you, Mayor Anderson. Do we have any additional questions or comments from the board members? I'm not seeing any, Mayor Anderson, but I would also like to thank OIR for their presentation. It's been informative, productive, and look forward to any clarification that you can provide to the questions asked by the City Commission. Please include the board in that correspondence and communication. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Payne. So first of all, from me, I just want to say thank you very much, Chair Payne. You know, we tag team this thing. First time in, I think we didn't look like rookies, so I hope we pulled that off together. I appreciate doing that together with you and with the whole board that was here tonight. One of the luxuries that I have, and maybe before I get into final comments, I should get back Manager Ritzma. Is there anything you wanted to add at this time?
No, Your Honor, I think we covered a lot of it through Commissioner Hess's question.
Okay, so thank you, Manager Ritzma. Thank you, city team, everyone who was here present this evening. And you know, even though you may not have directly participated in this discussion, I think it's important that you're part of it. And I very much appreciate that you're here. So one of the luxuries that I happen to have, you know, related to the honor of sitting in this seat is that I get to speak last. And that means that I get to speak after a lot of smart people and thoughtful people and caring people have already made some very clear statements and offered questions and set expectations. And so I don't have to go over all that again. I'm a lucky person to serve with a great team here on the commission and benefit greatly from the process of the fact that the 7 of us serve together. So I want to thank everybody for the comments that have been made and say that I am, those address things I've been thinking about and questions I had as well. So thank you for that. I guess just to sum that up, I wanted to quote first, actually, another commission colleague from the past. And this is former Commissioner, City Commissioner Matt Mazzarek. And I am going to apologize to him for a moment because I'm lifting his quote from a news article. And I know sometimes those of us in public service, when we're quoted in news articles, sometimes we're not entirely happy or feel that our quote was somehow mangled. So I'm lifting that quote and I hope it's acceptable. But out of an article that was just very recently on this whole topic, I thought that there was an intelligent comment made by Commissioner Mazzarek, and he's someone I respect a great deal who does some fantastic work here in Kalamazoo that occurred during his commissioner life and has really continued in earnest after his commissioner life as a housing developer at Kalamazoo Neighborhood Housing Services. But he was quoted as saying this: "It all comes down to the city and department being willing to be humble." He says, "I think we can rebuild trust if we start with a little bit of honesty that starts with saying we weren't perfect and we made bad calls." And I think that that is a simple and profound statement. And I appreciate the opportunity to get to quote Commissioner Mazzarek in terms of, I think, summing it up in a simple way possible is that walk humbly, listen to the community, be open about where we wish we hadn't been perfect. And I guess just to follow up on Commissioner Mazzarek's thoughts, I guess I want to say personally, and this whole commission is present, but just personally as it relates to that, there are certainly things that as mayor during this time, when I look back, I wish that there were, that there were things that we had done differently. And, some of those things were highlighted in the report from OIR. And I do not by any means suggest that the responses I had were perfect, and that I am very much open to us working together to see how we can be better together as a community. And I guess take personal responsibility for my own imperfections. And I appreciate you, Commissioner Mazzarek, for laying that out there. I will say that I believe that this commission and this board take this work and this report very, very seriously. And I think that that is something we communicate to city administration, not that they don't already take it seriously, but that we are wholly committed, this commission, and I believe future commission, to this continuing effort that we need to make so that we have not only a city, that feels like a fair, equitable place for everyone to live with hope and opportunity, but that includes actions of the city, most particularly as this report relates to our Department of Public Safety. Serious. And thank you once again, team, for doing this serious work together, our city team here on this. I am going to just unfortunately not close right there. I'd like to, but there's something else I just want to lift up, and it's generally related, but I feel like at this moment, we've had another tough day in the city of Kalamazoo as it relates to gun violence, and we've had a tough months and a tough last few weeks, particularly as it relates to youth and gun violence. And I think I want to take this moment to say tonight that there is certainly much conversation we can have about how we've gotten to this point, but I've had some serious conversations with some members of the Kalamazoo County Commission, and in addition with adjacent township officials. And we are at a moment where school will be starting soon, and we will have situations where challenges have been created, which are going to be moving into our partners in the school system. We have people in our neighborhoods that are suffering, and it is most certainly the time, if that time hasn't already passed, for us to very seriously talk publicly with our partners at the county, at the township, in the school system about getting a handle on our gun violence and how it is affecting us in this community, and particularly as it relates to young people in this community. I'm looking very much forward to some very serious action and conversation about that within short order, and look to our partners to join hands with us in that effort. Thanks once again for everyone who called in and made the effort tonight to do that, to all who participated in observing this meeting. And I just want to say very clearly from me, let's keep our hearts open. I love you, Kalamazoo. We are adjourned.